At its heart, the ideas and thinking that led to the formulation of the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis centers around the ability to tell a single consistent story. This story must be consistent with all the available evidence and must be able to literally explain everything. After all, a cosmological model is a theory of everything. Like Plato unshackled, emerging from his cave, stumbling into the light, blinking, and looking down upon virgin fields, whose knowledge and wisdom has yet to be tasted by human thought, for the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis gives voice to a higher existence whose invisible magnitude, if truly seen, would bring any man to his knees. Well, almost. In this work, I wish to tell you the current story of the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis as it continually evolves the more I research and develop my ideas. At its core, the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis is a cause and effect argument. Our universe began because of a massive undefined star-like object whose diameter measured over 1 billion light-years across came to the end of its life and went nova. In a previous work, in defining words, rather than saying a massive undefined star-like object whose diameter measured over 1 billion light-years across, I called such a hypothetical object a McLean. After all, it is the custom in astrophysics to name an object after the one who discovered it. That, and I was feeling very cheeky spotting the opportunity in history to carve my own name into the scientific story of creation. Anyway, what exactly are you supposed to do with the theory of everything? Have a bit of a laugh while laying out new physics whose applicational use would quickly give us the warp drive? Or actually, the first applicational use is in warping the fabric of space-time locally with an tokamak fusion reactor in order to create an artificial gravity well. Of course, if you're really smart, you no doubt realized that such an applicational use would allow humanity to live in a zero-carbon economy without sacrificing quality of life. In fact, we all get to become explorers, pioneers, adventurers as humanity travels into our solar system and beyond. Far, far beyond. While at the same time preserving the natural beauty of our own planet. And how does the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis make this possible? Well, very simple. By knowing exactly why and how nature and the universe as a whole actually ticks, then we are able to work with the laws of nature in order to create invention and application. That smartphone in your hand, the computer at your desk, all would not be possible without the work of Richard Feynman and quantum field theory. Such is the power of physics. So it is from here that we shall begin the tale of the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis, because of the two key pillars upon which the ideas that modern Big Bang cosmology in the realm of particle physics is founded. The first pillar is known as the baryon asymmetry to the universe, or rather, the imbalance between matter and antimatter. The second pillar is considered a fundamental law of physics called charge parity time symmetry, or simply CPT-Symmetry. To quote Wikipedia, charge parity and time reversal symmetry is a fundamental symmetry of physical laws under the simultaneous transformation of charge conjugation C, parity transformation P, and time reversal T. CPT is the only combination of C, P, and T that is observed to be an exact symmetry of nature at the fundamental level. The CPT theorem says that CPT symmetry holds for all physical phenomenon, or more precisely, that any Lorentz invariant local quantum field theory with Hermitian Hamiltonian must have CPT symmetry. Andrei Sakharov was a Russian nuclear physicist who in 1965 developed his 2D didactic cosmological model in considering both baryon asymmetry and CPT symmetry. In the simplified model, one dimension is for space and the other is for time. At its center lies the Big Bang singularity, from which two arrows of time emerge, each a mirror of the other. Here, Sakharov gave the first complete mathematical description of how two universes could emerge from a single event, one universe composed of matter and the other composed of antimatter. This description is so much more elegant to the currently established view in cosmology that almost all the matter and antimatter annihilated each other in the very first moment of creation, while almost everything, as a slight imbalance, created more matter, 1 part in a billion, according to the baryon asymmetry explanation. To be honest, it beggars belief that cosmologists, in describing the currently established Big Bang model, talk about there being scientific consensus in describing the Big Bang event to within a precision of 10 to the power of minus 50 seconds after the Big Bang event itself, when all the matter and antimatter was suddenly created and brought into existence. The reason for this so-called consensus comes from particle accelerator experiments conducted by physicists at places like the LHC and Fermilab. But on the other hand, mainstream cosmology has been happy to ignore a key principle of particle physics, namely Sakharov conditions and the consequences of T-symmetry. So in effect, cosmologists base their statements of experiments done by particle physics while ignoring the consequences of this key principle in particle physics. One cosmologist whose work I have recently become aware of is Jean-Pierre Petit, and his development of what is called the Janus cosmological model. My initial impression upon seeing Jean-Pierre's work was a huge sigh of relief, thinking, "Oh, thank God, I don't have to do the maths on that one." Let me clarify that statement. In my initial film, at the very end, I present two specific papers in order to point towards the mathematics. The first was James Farn's work regarding the ideas of negative mass and dark matter. The second was Julian Barber's A Gravitational Origin of the Arrow of Time paper. Jean-Pierre Petit's work combines both the ideas of negative mass and CPT-Symmetry to build a proper mathematical framework for his cosmological model. And like Jean-Pierre Petit and Andrei Sakharov, I myself came to the same independent conclusion about the existence of a parallel universe that is the mirror image to our own. I came to this conclusion because in thinking about the Big Bang singularity, I looked at how a known physical singularity behaves, namely a black hole. Matter falling into a black hole from an accretion disk encounters one of two fates. The first fate is that the matter falls into the black hole, never to be seen again. The second fate is that the matter is accelerated sufficiently along the electromagnetic lines of force coming from the black hole, such that it is ejected from either one of the poles. This ejection of material out leads to the formation of two output astrophysical jets. We can think of it this way because, firstly, as Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking showed, using Einstein's equations of general relativity, the Big Bang was in fact a gravitational singularity. Secondly, the pattern of an input accretion disk intersecting the equator of a black hole with perpendicular output jets emerging at the poles is the known and observed behavior. The resultant jets being ejected from the black hole's poles are called astrophysical or relativistic jets, and there are two of them. Each jet travels in opposite directions from one another along the axis that is defined by the poles of the black hole. And so in thinking about the Big Bang singularity having the exact same pattern of behavior gave rise to my independent conclusion. Given that one jet became our universe, then there exists a parallel mirror image universe to our own, being composed of antimatter emerging from the other jet. Moreover, the fact that the material coming from the input accretion disk can be ejected from either the north or south pole of the Big Bang singularity gives rise to a binary fate. This binary fate determines whether the material becomes matter or antimatter. So straight away we can see a binary cause and effect argument that gives rise, and more fundamentally, definition as to why matter is matter and antimatter is antimatter. There was no annihilation of matter and antimatter because the two never met. In fact, the material only becomes matter when it is actually ejected from the North Pole. And vice versa, the ejected material only becomes antimatter when it is actually ejected from the south pole. The actual material that falls in from the accretion disk could technically be described as photons because the plane of the disk is orthogonal to the direction of the jet. I should note that the choice of poles, north and south, is completely arbitrary. Physics, the study of nature at its core, is all about understanding the exact how and why nature works at the deepest level. To re-quote Wikipedia regarding CPT-Symmetry, an exact symmetry of nature at the fundamental level. But in studying the formation of each of the two jets from the input accretion disk, we can see how and why such a symmetry is actually given form as our universe is born. Pair production is the creation of a subatomic particle such as the electron along with its antiparticle pair, a positron, from a neutral force boson such as the photon. Although, as I will argue, particles as we know them are given physical form as the jet that is to become our universe came into being, I will for the moment use the grammar employed in describing the creation of subatomic matter in the context of pair production. In returning to thinking about the Big Bang as having an input accretion disk feeding the gravitational singularity at its heart, we imagine the fate of a single photon destined to be ejected from either one of the two output jets. Before being ejected, the orbit of the photon is around the singularity upon the plane of the accretion disk. Simplifying the orbit of the photon, we imagine its locus as being a circle lying on the input accretion plane with the Big Bang singularity at the center of the circle. We arbitrarily select a point on the photon's circular orbit along with its polar opposite in order to define an axis that runs through the singularity at the center. Pivoting the circular orbit, we introduce a slight angle of inclination such that half the orbit is now in the northern hemisphere and the other half is in the southern hemisphere. Of course, the Big Bang singularity is a charged rotating singularity described by the Kerr-Newman metric. The singularity is defined as having rotation and charge such that we can define two poles which form its axis of rotation. However, it also implies a much more complex elliptical event horizon, but for simplicity we model it as a sphere with radius rs, whose north pole is at point 00 rs and whose south pole is at point 00 minus rs. Next, we define the plane of the accretion disk as being the x and y plane intersecting the origin and bisecting the event horizon sphere at the equator. Thus, given arbitrary xp, yp belonging to the set of real numbers, we can define a point on the accretion plane as xp, yp, 0. The photon's orbit upon the accretion disk we had originally defined as a circle. Giving it concrete definition, we define a circle with radius rO that lies upon the plane of the input accretion disk whose center lies at the point of origin. Secondly, we note that the orbit is outside the spherical event horizon and thus implies rO is strictly greater than rs. Thus the circle is defined by the vector equation 1. We define the parametric value u as a temporal measurement and thus subsequently is thus represented as being equivalent to the t-axis in deriving the two helical escape paths. Also note that 1 has u less than 0 in order to indicate the time preceding the event wherein the photon bifurcates away from and leaves the accretion disk following one of the two helical escape paths. We define k as a constant in equation 1, such that we can control the point of bifurcation away from the accretion disk and onto one of the helical escape paths. Looking down the t-axis from above, we see that as u increases, the direction of rotation around the circle of the photon is anti-clockwise. Using the locus of the circle defined by equation 1, along with equating the parametric value u directly with time, we derive the first helical escape path traveling upwards and hence forwards in time. Namely, we simply define the first helical escape path as shown in equation 2. We derive the second helical escape path by performing a parity transformation upon our first helical path defined by 2, thus rendering equation 3. Actually, 3 is both a parity transform with respect to changing the sign of the x and y spatial coordinates and a time reversal operation with respect to the temporal axis t. Thus equation 3 is a CPT-Symmetric curve of equation 2. Remember that we originally defined the orbit as having a slight incline to the accretion plane, such that the photon is half in the northern hemisphere and half in the southern hemisphere. Let us define the axis along which the slight incline is defined as being along the y-axis. Thus we could rewrite equation 1 as the equation shown by 4. At u equal to 0, the point of departure for our photon, given that it escapes via the North Pole, is at rho, 0, epsilon, where k equals 0. Vice versa, the point of departure for our photon, given that it escapes via the South Pole, is at minus rho, 0, minus epsilon, where k equals pi. But for simplicity, let us define epsilon as being sufficiently small that for the bifurcational point of escape is approximately at either rho, 0, for the North Pole and minus rho, 0, for the South Pole. Let us now look at the rotation of equation 2 and 3, each with respect to their own arrows of time. That is, we consider the ideas of Andrei Zarkov in defining two distinct arrows of time. We denote these two arrows of time as t plus for our universe of matter and t minus for our parallel twin universe of antimatter. Our universe of matter comes from the North Pole, where t is greater than 0, and moving forward in time for our universe is defined as t monotonically increasing such that t plus is equal to t. Our parallel universe of antimatter is defined along its own arrow of time, denoted t minus, and defined by a simple time reversal operation. That is, as t is less than 0, monotonically decreases, then by the z component of equation 3, we have t minus equal to negative t. If we now define the charge that the photon gains as it becomes a subatomic particle by its respective rotation around its respective arrow of time, so for the t plus arrow of time, with respect to our universe, we look down the z-axis from above to see its rotation. Vice versa, for the t minus arrow of time, with respect to our parallel universe of antimatter, we look up the z-axis from a negative position. So from our example, looking down the t plus arrow of time, we see the photon has an anti-clockwise rotation around the t-axis. Vice versa, looking down the t minus arrow of time, we see it has a clockwise rotation. If we define the anti-clockwise rotation as negative charge and clockwise as positive charge, we can see how the photon gets its charge as it becomes either matter or antimatter. Also, the photon, which is invariant to time, becomes a particle of matter or antimatter as it starts to move along its respective arrow of time. Thus, in the t plus universe, the photon gains a negative charge because it has an anti-clockwise rotation around the t plus axis. Vice versa, in the t minus universe, the photon gains a positive charge because it has a clockwise rotation around the t minus axis. Thus we get charge conjugation symmetry. Putting this all together, we see parity, p-symmetry in the transformation of spatial coordinates between equations 2 and 3. Next, we see time reversal symmetry in the transformation of the temporal dimension in the transformation from 2 into 3. Then lastly, with respect to each universe's arrow of time, we have a negatively charged particle for our universe's t plus arrow of time, and a positively charged particle for our twin verse with its t minus arrow of time. Hence, charge conjugation C symmetry comes about. And so, we can see how a simplified model of the input pattern of an accretion disk with two output jets gives rise to this most fundamental law of physics, namely CPT-Symmetry. Of course, if you know how it forms, you can also understand how to create physical systems in which this symmetry can be broken. But before we get to Professor Martin Tajmer's experiments and the possibility of bending space-time in a local region, we need to understand how the arrow of time actually arises. The short answer is that it comes from the convection of flow around the jet's concentric ringed series of vortices. But before I can make that argument, we need to look at how retrocausality is actually a thing by looking at the quantum eraser experiment, thus leading me to actually define what exactly a fundamental particle of nature is, along with its respective pair with negative mass on the other, or imaginary, side of the field. Fortunately, at this moment in time, and only this moment, gives me a good example for showing retrocausality that is a bit of an odd coincidence. But before we leave our 3D graph example, I noticed a curious coincidence about my example while formulating it. Rather than carry out a time reversal operation in getting equation 3 from 2, we do not carry out the time reversal operation. Doing this renders equation 5 from equation 2. Plotting both equation 2 and 5, we get a very familiar structure. Specifically, a double helix, which is curiously the structural shape of the molecule of life, DNA. Also, if you just consider the structure of either equation 2 or 5 on its own, rendering a single helix, we have the structure of the RNA molecule. Now, there is an argument usually put forward by creationists regarding the improbability of life arising by pure chance. The argument goes that if the first protein molecules of life were created by the random process of amino acids coming together, then the chances of creating a useful protein is around 1 out of 10 to the power of 390. There are only around 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the observable universe. Of course, this argument relies on the idea that there is no existing substructure to the universe from which life can arise. For my own personal belief, I believe in the theory of evolution. Rather than the creation of life being an improbable event, I believe that life was a mathematical certainty. I believe that life is not unique to our planet, but rather our galaxy and universe is teeming with life. We just got to get out there and find it, even though they have found us first. Also, many arguments I will give in the future are based off eyewitness testimony from flying saucer encounters as we try to reverse engineer these craft. Having formulated this very simplistic mathematical argument for how and why we live in a CPT-Symmetric universe, it was only in actually writing these words that I picked up on this odd coincidence. There are some truths that when a man comes up against them, like love, you know is true. You know it is true all the way down to your bones. Well, that is how I feel in seeing this, because of my growing belief that we are far from alone in the universe. I believe this is no coincidence, as life needed a structural framework to arise from, and this is seen in the simple CPT-symmetric structure. The very structure of the molecules that encode the information of life itself, RNA and DNA, are mirrored from the perfect symmetry that was formed in the creation of our universe, coming from a massive billion light-year wide sun-like object coming to the end of its life and going nova. For in its death, the structure for life as we know it was physically born, and it is CPT symmetry. Of course, the living experience that is my journey, in order to communicate this one singular idea, has been revelation itself. My eyes see the evidence, but my mind blinks in total disbelief at such a wonder, and so I am compelled to throw everything I have, such that I am able to communicate this most simplest of ideas, a single picture of the creation of everything, which, to be honest, is a multifaceted impression based off a rendering as revealed by our Creator. Making these films in order to communicate the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis really forces me to do my homework in developing my ideas. For instance, the majority of the artwork, particularly the 3D animations, is my own artwork, as I try to communicate very specific dynamics and ideas in order to make my case. Essentially, I am trying to paint the most chaotic and cataclysmic events while identifying specific characteristics that are important to my hypothesis. When I began, I had a specific picture of a hypernova in mind, namely the one I have described to you of two jets fed by an input accretion disk. But the problem with the subject of hypernovae, or more specifically superluminous events, is that the study of these phenomena is currently undergoing a golden age of discovery. This is particularly spearheaded by LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, but it seems every other day in the course of making this film there is talk about some new paper or observation. One example is in thinking about faster-than-light travel as a relativistic trick of trigonometry coming from the astrophysical jet observations of the M87 galaxy. Another example is the idea of a Type 1 supernova being the trigger mechanism behind the most superluminous hypernova event observed in 2006. Here, the idea is that the massive giant star has swallowed a white dwarf that internally leads to a Type 1 supernova. Another explanation for the 2006 hypernova was that it was a pair instability supernova which blows up so completely that no collapsed core remains. Each explanation can then lead me to put forward an alternative Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis. In fact, it may not have been the hypernova of a McLean star-like object that caused the Big Bang. The main point of my idea is a single event caused two CPT-Symmetric output jets, each traveling away from one another in polar opposite directions. So another kind of event that produces a pair of gamma-ray bursts, like a hypernova, is the collision of two neutron stars merging to form a black hole. One extremely important characteristic that I haven't yet touched upon previously is in describing the birth process of supermassive black holes, but in order to describe this process, we need to define a few words and terms of meaning. Following the logic that fractal geometry is a cosmological principle, we know that self-similar patterns repeat themselves at any scale. So, in my original film, I make the case that the Boites supervoid is the shadow of a McLean upon our universe. Our universe, or Jetaverse, is thus contained within a much larger verse, of which we are but a small subset. In defining names, let us call this larger verse the SuperVerse, as it is the superset to our universe, but following the same patterns and dynamics as we witness here in our verse. Another term that I found that helps convey meaning is on the next scale up, in inferring the same patterns and dynamics of a known and observable event in our universe, such as a nova, but imagining it happening outside of our universe and at a much larger scale in the volume occupied by the superverse. Applying the phrase on the next scale up to the Mandelbrot set, we can see the famous fractal pattern being repeated on the next scale up as we zoom out. In turn, I imagine zooming outside the volume of our Jetaverse and seeing the same pattern of stars and galaxies that we see in ours. So we can say, our universe came into existence because of a massive star-like object in the superverse on the next scale up, came to the end of its life and went nova, in order to explain the Big Bang event. With that outline, let us now describe the birth process that gave rise to a supermassive black hole being at the center of every galaxy in our universe. As iron comes to dominate the fusion process at the core, it consumes energy, which triggers the Type 2 superluminous nova, or hypernova, as the core collapses in on itself. In these moments, all the elements of nature heavier than iron are formed, as heavier elements are fused together to form even heavier elements. Ultimately, this leads to the formation of elements such as thorium and uranium. Now, in thinking about the same pattern and dynamics on the next scale up, in the context of the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis, we imagine the McClane going nova. Following the core collapse of the McClane, we have the fusion of heavier and heavier elements. Here, I first try to imagine what a particle is on the next scale up and see a black hole, incompressible with an event horizon. This was the argument I put forth in saying black holes are fundamental particles, and the reason why my rendering of particles has space-time distorted around them. So instead of the pattern of atoms being fused into heavier ones, we have black hole particles being fused together into larger and heavier black holes. Ultimately, this act of fusion comes from the collapsing core of the McClane, gives birth to supermassive black holes. The rebounding shockwave from the implosion of the core carries and ejects these newborn supermassive black holes out, following the path of the jet, thus scattering and seeding our newborn universe. Of course, this argument, and by extension the entire Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis, is based upon the assumption that two output jets actually form from an input accretion disk. After all, I am making a very big song and dance and arguing that this is the pattern and shape that gave birth to our universe. So let us do an experiment together. Google the term accretion disk and look at all the images. Maybe Google knows me too well, but nearly every picture I get is exactly what I have been talking about, but in respect to our universe, at our scale. Namely, artistic renderings showing a black hole with an input accretion disk intersecting the equator, with two output jets traveling away from each other in a CPT-Symmetric pattern. As an aside, I specifically describe it in the context of a hypernova, rather than say a quasar. Firstly, because I am looking for a single near instantaneous event, as we call it the Big Bang event. Secondly, if it was the big long continuous jet event, then I would expect the cold spot on the CMB to be the hot spot. One key body of work that I have recently come across is the SXS collaboration, who have aggregated together a goldmine of scientific work from LIGO and associated institutions and scientists in regards to gamma ray bursts and hypernovae. This particular simulation is a numerical model by Philip Mosta of Berkeley University, which shows the electromagnetic field lines within the hypernova. Watch how the jet forms along the axis defined by the pole, following the existing flow of rotation. Also note the multiple layers that ultimately are shaped into a series of concentric ringed vortices. Here, in this cross-section of the simulation, 20 milliseconds after core bounce, we can see the basic pattern of two output jets fed by an input accretion disk. Of course, looking at the larger image from Philip Mosta's paper, it does make me consider the problem of baryon asymmetry in terms of there being a wobble in the jet. Now, a key argument that I am trying to communicate is the idea that quantum fields, such as the electromagnetic field, have an origin story. That is, they arose from the vortices arising from the Big Bang Hypernova event. But gravity is a different matter, because it had to exist as a force within the SuperVerse, and is why Julian Barber's work is a key piece of my thinking. Taking both the simulations of the electromagnetic field lines within a hypernova and scaling up to the next level, we arrive at a simple equivalence statement following the logic of self-similar patterns. Gravity is equivalent to the electromagnetic force, but on the next scale up. That is, the force we know as gravity is equivalent to the electromagnetic force in the SuperVerse. It was the force of the field lines of gravity caused by the nova of the McLean that gave shape to our CPT-Symmetric universe, the particle representation of that field being to us a black hole, or rather, we see it as a single quantum system, as to a single atom or collection of atoms in a Bose-Einstein condensate is a single quantum system to us as well. Gravity is equivalent to the electromagnetic force, but on the next scale up. Let us reinforce this statement by looking at solidity. I cannot pass my hand through my desk, because to me, at my scale, it is solid, but ultimately it is because of the repulsion between the electrons in the atoms of my hand and the electrons in the atoms of my desk. This repulsion between the same charged electrons, carried by the electromagnetic force, causes a desk to appear solid. Remember that the vast majority of space, in fact 99.9999999999999% of space is vacuum. Now we imagine our McLean-like star measuring over 1 billion light years in diameter as having an electromagnetic field. But this actual field is what to us we call gravity. The McLean in the Boyerty supervoid has solidity and existed in a time before our universe was born into a much larger superverse. The Jetaverse, that is our universe, flowed around and enveloped the Boyerty's McLean, for which to us is a supervoid. This act implies solidity that we in fact currently call dark energy. As the electromagnetic force imbues solidity to our universe, so too does gravity imply solidity to the superverse that exists on the next scale up. There hasn't been a true revolution in physics for a long time. For one, the experimental apparatus and infrastructure required to prove the predictions of already established theory are some of mankind's greatest engineering achievements. To name a few, the Large Hadron Collider at the CERN, which proved the existence of the Higgs field. Another is LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, which observed the ripples in spacetime from the gravitational waves caused by a pair of colliding neutron stars billions of light years away. But a revolution is coming, as again and again I see the same look of panic in physicists' eyes, as once held assumptions are shattered, usually to the chorus of, "Well, we weren't expecting that." The discovery that Hubble's constant is not so constant is one example. Another, but more pertinent example, being the possible discovery of the X-17 particle, what some have coined the fifth fundamental force of nature, has really caught the attention of the global physics community. There was no annihilation of matter and antimatter, because the two never met. In fact, the material only becomes matter when it is actually ejected from the North Pole, and vice versa, the ejected material only becomes antimatter when it is actually ejected from the South Pole. The actual material that falls in from the accretion disk could technically be described as photons, because the plane of the disk is orthogonal to the direction of the jet. Is my quote from earlier, that echoes again and again in my mind now. The production of an electron and a positron is a prime example of the pattern of behavior that I am describing, where each travels in polar opposite directions along an axis as defined by the Higgs mechanism. For a hypernova, on the next scale up, it is the production of a pair of astrophysical jets traveling along an axis defined by the rotation of the exploding star as it goes nova. Following the same logic that self-similar patterns are invariant to scale, then on the next scale up, I describe it by way of the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis. So an easy question to ask becomes, what happens when the angle between the two particles or jets is not 180 degrees? Well, I now have experimental evidence in the form of the X-17 particle, but my line of thinking hasn't changed, because in the eyewitness descriptions coming from the Phoenix Lights and US Navy Close Encounter descriptions, I have been toying with the idea of producing our own quantum fields. A common description being of what sounded like some kind of force field either surrounding the various craft or existing between the saucer craft themselves. The idea is beautifully simple, in that if we know exactly how and why quantum fields such as the electromagnetic and Higgs fields came into being in the first place, then we can try and reproduce that same mechanism to create our own fields. The argument I have just presented is a step along the path to exactly how and why quantum fields arise. The discovery and details of the X-17 particle experiment is another step along that same path. But before I can lay out my full thinking on this subject, I really need to present a large amount of evidence and arguments, particularly in exactly defining what a fundamental particle actually is, namely a volume of temporal equilibrium between counterflowing hours of time. Here, on the vacuum side of the quantum field, the arrow moves from our past into the future. Then, on the other side of the quantum field, into the incompressible verse, with its negative mass counterweight particle, where the arrow of time moves from our future back into the past. All this coming from the convection flow of concentric vortices. The quantum fields themselves collectively are a series of concentric ringed vortices formed from the gravitational field lines of the Big Bang singularity. The Higgs field forms the central axis, which is surrounded by the first vacuum space. Here, force is transferred by the gluon particle, and the arrow of time moves forward as this space moves forward from the ordered vacuum state of our SuperVerse into a disordered quark-gluon plasma. Moving from the gluon vacuum space, we cross over into the first incompressible vortex quark space. Here, initially because of the heat and energy of the nova explosion, it starts off in a disordered state, which then becomes ordered into quarks and then form protons and neutrons. Thus, the arrow of time, by the second law of thermodynamics, moves from the ordered state of protons and neutrons and towards the chaotic and disordered state that was the Big Bang Hypernova inside this incompressible space inside particles. Moving outwards from the incompressible quark space, we travel into the vacuum where the Z and W bosons convey force. Again, the ordered vacuum state at absolute zero, heated by the oncoming jet, moves from a state of order into disorder as the vacuum of the SuperVerse mixes with the oncoming jet that is evolving into the universe we know. Because of the heat of the jet coming from the quark and lepton vortex rings, this vacuum space heats up. The ordered cold, with a relative temperature that is to us absolute zero, mixes with the hot superfluidity of the jet's vortex, bringing disorder to the perfect vacuum. Now the vacuum has become a disordered ocean of virtual particles exhibiting the Casimir effect. Here, following the second law of thermodynamics, the arrow of time moves from our past into our future. But the vacuum space of the weak nuclear force is in itself its own closed verse, with its own arrow of time separate to the one we see with our eyes. This is the fundamental reason why we consider radioactive decay to be an invariant to time and a totally random process. It exists in its own closed universe, which, like a Russian doll, is contained within the fabric of the atom. Just as our own universe occupied by the space between the leptons and the outermost layer, which to us is the fabric of space-time, is itself a closed universe, with the arrow of time moving away from the Big Bang. Again, the same argument and reasoning for the space occupied by both the incompressible lepton and space-time layers each one having its own reversed arrow of time. Here, the arrow of time moves towards the Big Bang and the moment of creation. The hot, disordered matter that is both the leptons and space-time vortex rings cools down into the ordered universe, giving rise to the reality we live in. As entropy and disorder increase, the closer we get to the Big Bang inside these spaces, then by the second law of thermodynamics, the arrow of time is towards the Big Bang. The disordering of vacuum and the ordering of fields into particles and atoms all happened around the seeds that were blown into the universe at the very beginning, namely the final fusion process of the McClane as it goes nova, the supermassive black holes. Also, because of the chaotic process that is the nova of the McClane, these seeds were scattered randomly, such that we now observe a universe that is mostly homogeneous and isotropic. We know from the solution of Einstein's field equations that our universe appears to begin as a cone that expands as time progressed. Putting this idea together with this concentric ring shaped, echoed here in Penrose's CMB rings, we can see this pictorially in this rendering. Just in case, Roger, if you see this, I hope that answers your question about the Big Bang and the second law of thermodynamics. Noting that in using fractals as the cosmological principle, that self-similar patterns repeating at any scale is the one and only assumption that I make. Isn't self-similar patterns repeating at any scale a subset of fractal geometry, which is but a subset of conformal geometry? But when it comes to deep philosophical questions about physics and conscious thought, the mystery runs much deeper than science can externally account for. The Cartesian geometry of nature. My eyes see the real world, but my soul feels, and so I can see. A nagging lifelong question for me, is there an afterlife or not? And if so, why not make up your own? I did, and look what it got me. One persuasive story was that of Eben Alexander, a neurologist from MIT, who in 2008 had his own near-death experience. It was in his description about falling through the universe and into a tunnel of light that gave me the idea about the reverse arrow of time. Maybe his conscious soul, departing from his body, actually did literally fall back through time to the very beginning and the source of all creation as we know it. The validity was in seeing the potential for a simple solution to the black hole information paradox, but I need a couple more episodes before I can unpack my thoughts on that topic. But as astrophysical jets radiate light out into our universe, so too must our jetiverse radiate energy out into the surrounding SuperVerse. With all that said, I can now finally move on to my final argument, which from my philosophical point of view as a scientist, I cannot make as a scientist. Rather, it is the artist within me that makes this argument. Thinking for me about the universe and the Big Bang is completely abstract and has no bearing on the way I live life day to day. For what I have encountered and been confronted with along the road to discovery is very hard to put into words. Totally life-changing, with my jaw on the floor at what was once supernatural to me, but now is natural. My original film is testimony to my journey and where it led me, for in looking at my original cross-sectional diagrams, I noticed a common pattern between what I had drawn and the entire spectrum of human spirituality and belief. We humans have been drawing diagrams depicting the shape and structure of the Big Bang since our ancestors invented artwork some 50,000 years ago. That is my firm belief. Concentric circles, trees, pillar of life, it makes sense when you consider the fact that the cosmological principle is fractal and self-similar patterns replicate themselves at any scale, even on the human scale, in our most sacred artworks. But there is for me one piece that exemplifies this artwork above all others. In fact, the motivation, reasoning, and explanations that I have just now presented in the context of the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis was and is driven by this one singular piece. For the old purely materialist part of myself, driven by deterministic causality and complete scientific rationality, it feels like an act of pure scientific blasphemy. Another part of me, my heart, looks at it and says, but of course, what else did you expect? A meaningless nihilistic universe? Please, do me a favor. My heart sees the evidence and says, don't question it, take it upon faith. My brain sees the evidence and screams in disbelief as reality reordered itself, the seismic earthquake of my world map. The arguments I presented, the products of that titanic struggle, of that journey I told elsewhere in my original film, where at the very end I presented that piece of most sacred art. In one statement, to me, the patterns and dynamics of how our universe was formed in the Big Bang Hypernova event are mirrored perfectly in the artwork of two ossuaries originating from the 1st century Jerusalem at the time of Jesus Christ. In fact, the first ossuary belongs to the very man who sent Jesus to the cross in the first place, and, as I will argue, so too are the nails that were used to crucify him. In all probability. I may have presented it in my original film, but I never explained exactly why. I couldn't explain it because it took the making of this film in order to sufficiently paint enough detail such that explanation can be given. Now I can. Starting from the bottom of the central pillar, or jet, we have a conical bottom. This conical shape reflects the point where time for our universe began, as study of Einstein's equations of general relativity has shown us. Following Einstein's obsession in later life, we have the unification of forces, or rather, it is the bifurcation of the jet giving rise to a central Higgs mechanism, the quarks, and the leptons. We see it here as a cross-section through the jet that is for us all of creation, our universe. Thus our universe opens up like a flower, as a concentric series of ringed vortices that is the output jet of the hypernova. Now remember the argument from earlier regarding the multiple hours of time in line with entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. I would not have had the faith and courage to pursue that argument that I have only put into words for the first time here, if it was not for the 6 hours all pointing to heaven between 7 cornices. In fact, it was this very specific detail that caught my full and undivided attention when I first watched Simka Jakukovic's documentary regarding the archaeology and discovery of the Caiaphas ossuaries. In fact, this is the artwork I had originally drawn in order to reason out my ideas before I even made the connection between a religious artwork and the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis. The red lines depict a forward arrow of time in a vacuum, with the blue lines being the reverse arrow of time. Now, filled with a sense of total humility in presenting this, I can only pray that I managed to communicate this with the reverence and respect that it truly deserves. But honestly, I'm lost for words. My jaw is on the floor as my mouth mumbles incoherent madness as my brain scrambles for a rational explanation. Humor is my primary defense mechanism, keeping my ego in check and feet planted on terra firma. But of that rationality being a main theme within my original film describing the Big Bang Hypernova hypothesis. Another key argument I have presented here for the first time is the origin story in regards to how each galaxy came to have a supermassive black hole at its heart. This argument exists because of this central pillar, whose imagery within my mind is to me like a shared memory that I know is not my own, but external to me. The idea was reinforced by numerical models and other artwork depicting hypernova events, then solidified by seeing the alchemical pattern of fusion that renders uranium being repeated in the Big Bang Hypernova event. Moving on to the two main flower of life symbols, depicting the moment consciousness was born into the two universes. This symbol alone already has a huge history and meaning, but there are two of them, one for each jetiverse. To my eyes now, it is the initial structure of the jet as seen in cross-section. The standard model of physics tells us there are 6 leptons and 6 quarks, which in total forms all the known matter in the universe. In thinking about streamline solutions, I imagine 6 main streamlines in the first concentric vortex of the jet. But I really would like to try and see it through the lens of E8 and emergence theorem. Going straight to the end, we have our universe composed of a series of concentric ringed vortices. This is seen in the concentric rings found on the microwave sky and forms a key piece in Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmological model. Here, this is seen on the second and far more ornate and famous of the two ossuaries, which belong to Joseph, the son of Caiaphas, as this is the name written on it. If we see the flower of life as the beginning of the sequence, and the concentric circles as the end of the sequence, then we fill in the details with all the other pictures in the sequence. So I imagine the jet hitting the surrounding matter that was already blown off by the McLean as it reached the end of its life. Just as Betelgeuse is now, and as our sun will become one day, it will swell up into a red giant as the fusion process changes fuel. The swelling and expulsion of matter sheds material from the dying sun in layers, through which the final nova will rip as it becomes a nebula. Thus I imagine the jet that is our universe striking and hitting these different layers, causing a reaction that ultimately gave birth to the laws of physics of our reality. The evolution of the jet into a series of concentric rings where space-time has been folded up into an 11-dimensional verse. String theory nearly gets it, but it could never tell the time. The timing and sequence I see pictured here on the more famous of the two ossuaries. Also, in turn, I imagine the shockwave of our jetiverse, triggering the birth of new McLeans in the SuperVerse, as such a jet does in ours. But just before I wrap up, I wish to introduce one more thought. On the day Caiaphas sent Jesus to the cross, how could anyone imagine that this was probably the most significant point of Western history? Our entire religion and culture in the West is based off this one event, so anyone who had a rationalist viewpoint could not see that the execution of the lunatic that had declared himself king would lead to the foundation of a major world religion that never seemed to forgive this one act. It would be better if one man died for the people, as the occupational Roman authority would massacre the entire country when faced with insurrection, and Caiaphas knew this, as my 15th later demonstrated. In some sense, I see Caiaphas as a free market capitalist and Jesus as the socialist overturning the markets. The sun rebels against the god of capital, Saturn, in order to get a monopoly on belief. Now, going by Simca's description, that crucifixion nails were seen as powerful amulets and talismans, it would make sense that a very good money earner was the trade of crucifixion nails. One man had the monopoly on this market, namely the Jewish high priest, Caiaphas. As noted, Caiaphas probably didn't lose too much sleep at first about sending Jesus to the cross. By the time Caiaphas came to the end of his life, the tales of the risen king he had persecuted and executed must have haunted him as the cult of Christianity began its rise. So to protect himself in the afterlife, he kept and took the nails to his grave that were used to crucify an innocent man. But hey, what could I possibly know about such matters? Anyway, I'm off to Millie Ways for breakfast, and probably pop into their new Apollo's bar. Until next time.